in America that are broke. There's a grab to say, let's sell off everything the public sector owns. Let's give it to the bankers and the creditors, and there won't be any government anymore. We will be the government. And that's basically what free market economics is. It's centralized planning in the hands of Wall Street and the banks. The idea of free market economics is to take planning out of the hands of government, out of the hands of elected officials, and to put them in the hands of the bankers, who then will take a banker's eye view of the world and just lower living standards until you have what happened in Russia, where Vladimir Putin said that neoliberal privatization there had killed more Russians than World War II, had shortened the lifespan, reduced public health, led to lower birth rates, lower marriage rates, and immigration. And the effect of neoliberal economics is just as devastating as war. So essentially, finance is the new form of warfare in a non-military sense. It's cheaper, it makes money, and people seem to not even realize that they're under attack.
I'm speaking with financial economist and historian Dr. Michael Hudson. Today's show, The View from Europe. I'm Bonnie Faulkner. This is Guns and Butter. You contrast Latvia with its neighbor Belarus in your article, The Spectre Haunting Europe. Belarus has a centrally planned economy. What then is the difference between Belarus and Latvia? The point of this is that Belarus is doing better economically, correct?
Yes, people make fun of it because it's not a very politically free economy. It's said that there's a lot of corruption there, but at least its metrics economically do a lot better than those of Latvia, ironic as it may seem. I think Jeff and I put that in mainly because we wanted to say, look, all of you make fun of centrally planned economies, but bad as they are, unfree as they are, politically corrupt as Stalinism is, at least it's not as bad as neoliberalism. That was what we were saying, not that we're advocating that everybody be like Belarus.
Right. You say that social democracy and peace are at stake. How so?
Well, social democracy is supposed to be based on democracy, and people are supposed to vote. But the financial sector wants to make central banks, as they are in the United States, outside of the voting process. It is said that the hallmark of democracy is an independent central bank, meaning we will screw you no matter what you vote. No matter who you vote in, you can't stop us. You can't do anything because we are appointed by politicians for long periods of time. There's nothing you can do to bring us under control, and we can kill you if we want, and that's just exactly what we intend to do, try to stop us. That's why democracy and finance are antithetical.
What is the connection between economic depression and war?
Well, war has brought some countries out of economic depression, but in the past, the way to destroy a country was by military invasion, and today you can destroy it by pushing it into a financial depression, by getting it into debt, and then forcing its government to run a budget surplus, to raise taxes, to pay off the debt, to privatize its schools, to privatize its roads, to privatize its hospitals or close them down, to stop Social Security, to stop pensions, to stop paying on social things, to stop. The idea is to use at least 75% of the tax revenues to pay the bankers on debts and back interest that have mounted up, which was the case of many countries in times past.
How important are capital controls and government investment in the economy?
Government investment, basically governments will borrow from Western banks to put in place an infrastructure, thereby getting the money to employ Western firms that build it up. And then having put it in place, it'll turn around and privatize them for maybe 1 penny on the dollar and give them all away. So the West, having already got paid once, can now get paid all over again by having a huge stock market boom, which is what happened in Russia when Russia became sort of the darling of the stock market in the mid-1990s.
So then how do the economic policies instituted after World War II in Western Europe contrast with the policies implemented in the 1990s after the Cold War in Eastern Europe? How do these economic policies differ?
After World War II, everybody expected governments to take the lead in building infrastructure, in supporting economic expansion. Governments followed a Keynesian policy, pro-labor policy. They put in place pensions and healthcare systems. Governments were part of a Keynesian type of social democratic expansion. Exactly the opposite occurred when the Soviet Union was carved up. There, wages went unpaid in Russia for 6 to 9 months. Instead of government taking the lead, the government essentially gave away all of the mineral rights, the companies, the land, the real estate to political insiders to sell off very cheaply to American and European investors. And you had privatization and Western bankers running things to shrink the economy. Throughout the Soviet Union, lifespans shortened, marriages declined, birth rates fell, emigration accelerated. In Russia, $25 billion worth of capital flight occurred per year at the time when the Russian stock market was booming for American and European investors. So you had essentially Russia following the junk economics that the Harvard boys from Harvard University imposed upon it, very much like the Chicago boys did in Pinochet's Chile after 1973, when there was a military coup there. And in fact, the Russian Free Market Party even called itself the Pinochetistas, looking at Chile as the free market model that they emulated. So you could say Russia was the final stage of the Chilean neoliberalism.
You write that in contrast to the Marshall Plan's government-to-government grants, the European Central Bank's focus has been on commercial lending to the Eastern European countries. What are the differences? In other words, then, would you say that Eastern Europe, instead of being helped, was simply being ripped off?
When governments spend money, it's basically on infrastructure or it's on social policies, and it usually employs labor. When commercial banks lend money, it's not to expand production or for a social purpose. It's usually lent against collateral in the form of real estate or other property. So the commercial banks essentially fueled a huge real estate boom in the Baltics and throughout the Soviet Union. You had the most rapid real estate bubble there of anywhere except for Iceland, which called itself a kind of quasi-post-Soviet economy. So the differences between a social democratic Keynesian expansion and a financialized bubble economy.
You write that Eastern and Southern European countries were brought into the Eurozone with its strong currency and strict government lending programs with no way to develop their manufacturing. What do you mean by strong currency? And what do you mean by strict government lending programs?
Well, a high currency exchange rate meant that labor is pretty high priced. When you change a currency, there's a world price for raw materials, a world price for oil, a world price for technology. But the only thing that changed when you devalue a currency is the price of labor. But these countries entered at a rather high exchange rate that was set basically by keeping their interest rates high enough to be able to borrow to support the exchange rate. So their industry wasn't competitive, and the European Central Bank prohibits central banks from lending to government. So the governments, if they ran a budget deficit, they couldn't do what the United States does and simply print the money electronically on their computer keyboards freely. They had to go out and borrow at interest from foreign banks. That was written into the European Constitution. And so these the Southern European countries were very high-cost economies and were unable to compete with the core countries of France and Germany.
Right. Well, what is the similarity between the IMF's austerity doctrine toward the Third World and the EU's expectations of Eastern and Southern Europe?
They're identical. The idea that governments, once they're in debt and once they owe foreign money, have to essentially squeeze money out of their labor force in order to pay debts. Now, third world countries under the IMF were supposed to devalue. And by devaluing their currency, they devalued the price of their labor and the rate at which their labor exchanged for imports and for raw materials. But under the European Union, they can't devalue the currency, so they have to simply lower wage rates there by drastic austerity programs, and they do that by creating massive unemployment. So the European policy towards Southern Europe and the Baltics is enough unemployment to keep wages low. Well, of course, what happens is when you pay people less than it costs them to live, they immigrate. They don't simply starve quietly in the country. There's a huge immigration, and that's why you have so many Baltic workers working abroad, so many Southerners, Greeks and Spaniards working abroad. There's a demographic crisis that's going to be occurring as a result of the financial austerity programs that didn't necessarily occur in the third world countries under the IMF in the 60s and 70s and 80s.
What restrictions does the euro place on its member countries?
Essentially that they are not permitted to lend to the central banks, and the central banks have to let the economy be run by commercial banks in America, England, and Germany. That the commercial banks become the central economic planners, not the government, and essentially that domestic democracy is overruled by centralizing planning in the financial institutions.
You write that aside from the misery and human tragedies that will multiply in its wake, fiscal and wage austerity is economically self-destructive. It will create a downward demand spiral, pulling the EU as a whole into recession. Isn't this also the case for the United States?
Well, you're seeing that in Wisconsin now and in California, and you're seeing that in the States. People believe that the next big budget financial crisis here will be defaults from the states and cities that can't pay their bills. Illinois, Chicago, Wisconsin, and they're all told to do what Greece and other countries are being told to do. Sell off all of your public domain. Chicago's been told to sell it off its streets and replace them with parking meters so that they can raise the money in advance. They've been told to sell off their roads and turn them into toll roads. So basically, the United States is in danger of being turned into a feudal type of toll booth economy. In other words, rent extraction. The idea today is not at all what Marx and socialists talked about 100 years ago, making profits. It's not about what the classical economists call profit. It's about rent extraction, pure monopoly power to charge for the access to use a road, to park, to use a hospital, to have education, to have medical care, for essentially monopoly rents on natural monopolies such as transportation and most basic infrastructure.
I'm speaking with financial economist and historian Dr. Michael Hudson. Today's show, The View from Europe. I'm Bonnie Faulkner. This is Guns and Butter. European governments are pursuing policies of privatization, which we have been discussing, cuts in social spending such as health and essential services. In Greece, in the last week of February, the 8th general strike since the financial crisis took place in response to passage of a privatization and deregulation law by the Greek parliament. The bill abolished regulations on 150 professions, including workers in public transport, civil engineers, doctors, lawyers, pharmacists. The deregulation was demanded by the IMF and EU as a condition for access to further loans. Greek officials have promised to raise 50 billion euros from privatization sales of state agencies. In the UK, the new government has just published its Big Society plan to release the grip of state control. The goal is really to privatize state services such as health and education and other essential social expenditures. Students in the UK have staged repeated mass demonstrations against this policy, but it's going forward.